Hello and welcome to yet another episode of my Kerbal Space Program NASA series. Picking up where we left off, finishing up the assembly of the solar array farm. I didn't bring enough pipe end links to finish the fourth array, so that's going to happen on a later mission. We're just going to bring some parts down on another spacecraft instead of pilfering something off like the Sky Crane. Because while the Sky Crane really does only need one of the connections to plug into the base proper, it does allow me to not really care too much about its orientation coming down. Just make sure one end is facing the base and we get it down within an acceptable range. And speaking of that note, we decided to plug it into the system because while we did previously refuel it, it is does not have any oxidizer in it, so we're going to have to cook up a batch with the refinery and pump it over. Also going to have to do that for the return spacecraft for these guys. But at the moment, it's just a matter of cleaning up the work site and getting everybody stowed into the HAB module. And I may have mentioned this in the previous episode, I'm not sure, but I did some testing, and even with the lights off, this thing can't make it through one Kerbal night without running out of power. So further on down the line, we're going to bring along some battery modules to increase its energy storage. You see how little oxidizer there is on that. Decided to get the refinery going. Nice view of the landing site with Kerbin in the background as the refinery does its stuff. Not a whole lot going on for the rest of the mission. They've pretty much accomplished all they can for the base assembly, so gonna start refueling everything. Although we should plant a flag and christen the site. Yes, that's Moon Unit Zappa. Older viewers will probably get that reference right away. Younger ones, if you get that, kudos to you. But with the fueling operations finished, we move the guys into the transit vehicle. And this was designed to be as absolutely disposable as possible. I didn't even put any life support modules on it because it had enough to make it from Kerbin to the moon, or from the moon to Kerbin. And vice versa, I guess. So, and to reduce the probability of accidentally deploying those, or firing up the Sky Crane module engines while it's still attached, we decide to manually decouple. And just for safety's sake, we'll manually activate the engine instead of staging. This is probably the simplest lunar return I've done in the entire series because there's no orbiting spacecraft to rendezvous with and make a return on. Don't have to change orbit to drop anything back. Which, coincidentally, this is the first time I got science from a vessel landed on the moon, which was kind of neat. Just do a standard return. It's really nothing fancy. I've done this several times now in this series. I ended up tweaking that maneuver just to make it a little more efficient. But I really like to get my periaps correct on return so I can just pretty much fly it hands off. Cutting down the landing and return drastically, just because there really wasn't even anything interesting happening here. I didn't even get to see the solar panels break up due to ferrum, so. Safe return. And here we are launching our first heavy rover. I overbuilt the transfer stage on purpose because I noticed I don't have a lot of comms coverage over the moon, so I decided to just leave it. I'm just going to park it in orbit. It's got batteries, solar panels, and antenna, so it can work. It can just plug into the existing network. It's not a perfect solution because I didn't put it in any specific orbit, but it's just one more possible point of contact. Like I established previously in the series, since the landing site has line of sight to Kerbin, I'm really never going to have to worry about losing satellite coverage with connection to the Sky Crane on a landing approach. That's a fairly critical consideration, which I don't think I would have deployed this base anywhere near the far side. Just because even if I had a comms network, it probably wouldn't have been such a great idea. And I think because I used the probe core from the cacti mod for this, for some reason it's still... I don't have full connection, but it's still operational. So that's kind of exploity, but I really wasn't aware of it until I started playing this flight. I had previously kept those fairings attached. I decoupled them when periaps was at 0, so I made sure I just disposed of them on the surface of the moon. The actual payload was strutted to those fairings once again, and so with that extra rigidity, didn't really want to lose it. So now that the rover is established in orbit, it's time to send our second crew. And this will be our first scientific exploration crew. We're going to deliver a lab module later on an unmanned flight, but these are the first guys who are going to be doing some scientific exploration of the moon on the current base. We've already had our Apollo program. Pretty simplified launcher, once again trying to make this spacecraft as disposable as possible. But it's kind of a new concept for me. This is a integrated lander and transit and return vehicle. And this launch didn't exactly go as efficiently as I was hoping. That Poodle engine was so underpowered that I actually had to waste a bunch of fuel burning up. But still had enough to make the transfer and landing. Nothing particularly interesting happened during the transfer, so we cut straight to the landing. Kind of a funky design for me. It was pretty much just based around trying to get those landing legs inside that interstage fairing. So it looks maybe a little something like Marvin the Martian would drive. At this stage, we need to unplug the sky crane so it can do its mission, and, yep, crash. Don't exactly know what caused it. I reloaded, everything was fine. This is why I quick save so often, because it's not entirely stable, but it's playable for me. These crashes happen maybe once a week, so I don't get too bent out of shape over them. But I have noticed, I think you can see the solar panels on the farm over there are collapsed. And I do have to redeploy them on the sky crane. I think this is all related to a crash state. But we are kind of off the reservation as far as historical NASA flights go. But I'm still calling this the KSP NASA series because I'm dipping into some actual NASA concepts that didn't quite get off the ground. This is more analogous to the Constellation Lunar Base concept. And so you see, that's kind of what I was going for with my sky crane and my rover deployment. Obviously, my rover's center of mass is much higher than it would be on that one. And that is going to be a design consideration I'm going to try to find a way around. But need to get that sky crane launched so we can make a rendezvous and bring our rover down. Wasn't exactly very exciting, but all my experience with lunar orbit rendezvous from my Apollo program really pays off here. Was able to get a pretty nice encounter even with a plane change. Relative velocity was still a bit high, but this thing's got insane delta V. 102 meters a second isn't too bad, actually. Trying to conserve RCS fuel for when we have a payload, because this thing just has a ton of reaction wheels. Which in real life you're not going to be able to get away with. Reaction wheels are not nearly as powerful as they are in Kerbal Space Program. And I still haven't strutted those separated beams together. Really need to make a note to do that. But here we are attached to our rover. I originally intended to drop it longitudinally like that concept drawing showed. Seeing that concept art a long time ago is really what gave me the inspiration to start building these sky cranes. So, do our Apollo style, well, just any type of landing on an airless body. It's much more efficient to drop your periaps lower above your landing site and then stop from there. And I wasn't exactly confident in my ability to burn this thing over to the base. I might have been able to, but I was really so close to the margins that I went for the safe approach and just dropped it in the crater. Because this thing is equipped to get itself out of sticky situations. I honestly never thought I'd actually have to use it, but funnily enough, on my very first landing with one of these rovers, I had to utilize my emergency system, which I alluded to previously in the video where I demonstrated both rovers in action. It can pull itself up too steep of a grade using the winch. It just kind of takes some coordination. I really thought I was going to be able to get out of the crater on my own power, but I started thinking about how far back my center of mass is, and being four-wheel drive, with the rear wheels going, that can be problematic. Burning in here, you notice I'm still in target mode, so I've got some forward velocity. Very last second, I cancel that out. Caught myself. Trying to keep thrust to weight ratio below 0, or below 1, once again, so that it doesn't bounce when it lands. Nice, slow, rather efficient descent. Just want a very gentle touchdown. The suspension can take it, but I don't want to bounce it around more than I need to. Took a while to quit ringing from that landing. Once it stabilized, we switched back over to the rover, or to the sky crane. And you can see just how much mass that rover is. I went from 70 meters a second to 215 by undocking. Played it a little conservatively. I just decided to get this close to the Mooner base instead of actually trying to land next to it. That was the original intent, but I didn't think I had quite enough Delta V, so played it safe, landed out. That's one of the advantages of having the truck on the moon now. It has a mobile source of fuel it can tank up, drive over to the sky crane, and fill it from there. Here we have, I believe, Dude Free Kerman setting out to become the first Kerbal to drive a rover, or a wheeled vehicle, on the surface of another body. Still haven't fixed those solar arrays at this stage. But yeah, as I was saying, I previously talked about how this thing can winch itself out using a ground pylon and a connector. I ended up having to use it on my very first flight, funnily enough. And with the rear-wheel drive, with the rear wheels engaged in front-wheel drive mode, I was actually very worried that if I hit an incline, with that center of mass being so far to the rear, that the nose would lift and the rear tires would keep trying to propel it forward, and then we'd have a self-reinforcing roll and very rapidly have it get out of control. So as I started doing this, I started coming up with the idea of making a list of things to add as I go along to get it better prepared for Duna mission, because once we're out there, we're not going to be able to really reconfigure anything. Once they're on their transit burn, as I said previously in another video, they are committed. So we're going to try to make this as painless as possible and just make a generally capable all-around vehicle. Kind of a funky hatch location for this cockpit. It's been that way for ages. I don't know if they're going to change it, because really, geometrically, this cockpit doesn't make a lot of sense. You have a front seat and a rear seat and an airlock all packed into there. I don't care. It's still one of my absolute favorite command modules. I think it's just perfect for a futuristic-looking rover. And here we start planning our escape from the crater. And really the only option I've got is this section where the rim wall looks like it's collapsed a little. Anything else is just going to be far too steep. So we decide to set a course for that depression. And this is where I start putting my list together. I really need to get the center of mass centered and moved as low as possible. And I'd like to set up some action groups to switch between front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, and all-wheel drive. Because I decided to just start off and put this thing in front-wheel drive mode, not even try to get out in four-wheel drive, and just about tip it over 5 seconds after starting, which was kind of an ignoble beginning. But also added to the list, we should probably put a hotkey for SAS torque on there, because there are situations in low gravity where it's very useful, but there are other situations where it's very detrimental to your rover survival. Showing off the advanced displays in the new B9 5.0 release, which is really useful because I can use those cameras to see where I'm going and take a bit more accurate view of the terrain grade. Seeing that suspension working overtime. This is actually, I'm really proud of this thing. It looks cool and it functions. That center of mass is very problematic, and at this point I started worrying about being on too steep of a lateral incline, which if you've ever driven a riding mower, they all have that warning sticker somewhere talking about, you know, drive up and down hills, not across them. But that's really not going to be an option for me here sometimes because it's just completely unbroken terrain. So I need to start thinking of ways to recover this thing if it goes over without having to get the other rover involved. Because if both rovers go over, then we're really in trouble. And I think six-wheel drive would be a good benefit because I can leave the rear wheels unpowered under all circumstances and still have four-wheel drive power, which would get me over some steeper inclines. Would also keep it from torquing over because those rear wheels would act kind of like wheelie bars on a drag racer, if you've ever seen them. They would kind of counteract that torque as the nose tries to come up. In 15-degree incline, this thing handles like a champ, no problem. Take it up to 20 degrees, and it slows down a little, but it's still powering ahead. 22 degrees, and things start to get really slow, and about 25, 26 degrees, it just doesn't have the power anymore. So I decided to run it up the hill as far as I can get it. Which actually made pretty good distance, all things considered. I think I had to empty those fuel tanks at the bottom to give the Sky Crane a little extra Delta V. I really think if those are full, this will be a little easier to handle. And I think I'm going to add winches on the side for rollover recovery, so it can just pull itself up, so long as it's got something to anchor to. And that's as far as it's going to get on its own, so we have to kind of improvise here and come up with a AAA Roadside Assistance scheme. Unfortunately, I really wasn't planning on having to do this, so I had to check what supplies I had on hand, and I ended up pilfering the base module, or the base of one of those solar arrays. Contrary to what I said in my earlier episode, you can actually lift a ground pylon with RCS in lunar gravity. There was no way I was going to try to walk this thing out. But if you jump and pretty much just hold shift until you get to your destination. See, I burned all my EVA propellant just to get over here. It was a very short flight. Send our third Kerbal out. Everybody's having very ungraceful exits from the HAB module. Bounce over here and gonna snag a radial connector port because this lower stage is not going to be reused at all, so pretty much anything on here that I can grab that I want, I pretty much should. Cut a little bit out. This was a very long operation. It probably took me about an hour and a half. This has been severely condensed for everybody's sanity's sake, even running in 4 times time acceleration. This would have made an episode in and of itself. A very boring episode, but 20 minutes of stuff nonetheless. I really try not to waste anybody's time here. So we walk him out to use him as a place marker to see the exact range limit on the winch. Go back and grab the radial connector port where we left it. I didn't want to bring it closer to the job site because on the incline, I was afraid it would just roll down the crater wall and then finally pick up enough velocity that it explodes, as things tend to have a habit of doing in Kerbal Space Program. So we install that. And with his EVA propellant completely exhausted, we move him into the rover so he can recharge. And this is where not skimping on your ladders comes in very handy, to make sure you have enough ladders to get you to the very top of where you're getting, so that even if your RCS pack is completely exhausted, you can still get up there. With him safely stowed away, we plug the connector in. Once we get the Kerbal selected instead of the ground pylon. And then back to the rover to activate the winch. I originally set the speed really low because if you need more speed, you can always add it. If you go too fast and ruin something, well, you've already ruined it and you can't go back after the fact. So I set the winch speed to pretty much its bare minimum just to get started, just to make sure this whole crazy scheme would still work. As they say, no plan survives first contact, so. But very slowly it starts to winch itself up. Get a nice view of the passenger cabin. This being the passenger rover, I've got a more utilitarian cargo rover, and it's actually better balanced as far as center of mass goes. It's pretty much dead center on that one. And it brings along RCS tanks for resupplying and refurbishing spacecraft. After a very long winching operation, we decided to stop a little short because if it gets close enough, it's going to start lifting the rear wheels off the ground because it'll start trying to winch itself down. Go ahead and stop short for safety's sake. Now always make sure I connect the winch port to a Kerbal instead of letting it drop, because it probably would have rolled down the hill and then I'd have to go chase it. Had to repeat this operation a couple times, and like I said, this is severely edited down. It's not the most interesting thing to watch, but it is kind of neat having something go wrong and just kind of organically coming up with a solution on site. And after our final winch operation, I noticed the ground incline was a lot lower. Not a lot, but enough so that it could probably haul itself up. So that saved me a lot of trouble. I was really worried about, like I said earlier, if the winch point, if the connector is too far below the winch, I run the risk of pulling the nose of the vehicle down and lifting the rear up. So I really didn't want to try that on the crater rim wall. I just imagined that was going to go terribly, terribly wrong. And I will eventually figure out what key to hit to just switch back and forth between recently deployed spacecraft. Instead, I've tabbed through the whole base. Go ahead and retract and stow the winch. And you see how low the battery's getting. I decided to turn off the lights, and that's really, towards the end, I really stepped up the winch speed, just because I had to get this over. And once I found out those cabin lights don't actually draw electricity, I decided to leave them on. It looks kind of nice. But for our final design consideration, we're going to add a ground pylon to this thing permanently, so it always has it for recovery purposes. Thank you for watching this episode, and we will get to our scientific exploration of the moon using our new Constellation-era equipment in our next episode.